Your brain needs support, and new Ollie Brainy Chews are a delightful way to take care of your cognitive health. Made with scientifically backed ingredients like Thai ginger, L-theanine, and caffeine, Brainy Chews support healthy brain function and help you find your focus, stay chill, or get energized. Be kind to your mind and get these nootropic chews at ollie.com. That's OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Today on CityCast Chicago, we've got more grades for the mayor's first year in office. CPS and CTU are together in Springfield, and the Bears schedule is now available. To help me break it all down, WTTW City Hall reporter Heather Sharon and author and professor Ariane Nettles. It's Friday, May 17th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Morning, Ari. It's good to see you again. We sat down earlier this week at Call and Response Books in Hyde Park.
You.
And of course, that means I had to just have you come on the podcast this week as well.
Always. My favorite place to be.
We appreciate you. And Heather Sharon, one of CityCast's most prolific guests. Thank you for being back, taking some time away from City Hall to join us today.
I'm happy to be here.
If you are new to CityCast Chicago, welcome. Again, we've been here, 801, 802 episodes at this point. I lose track, but we are glad that you have finally joined us. Every single Friday, we like to bring in our friends, these voices from across the city that we admire, that we are grateful for, but we also need help making sense of some of these big stories that are happening in the city every single week. But before we get into those, I want to look back on an episode we did last week. I'm still thinking about it because this week, more of Chicago's farmers markets are coming online for their summer season. I don't know about y'all, but I'm a big farmers markets fan. Go back and listen to the episode. I picked up a fresh loaf of sourdough. I picked up some strawberry jelly like I do every single time I hit up a farmer's market. So I want to check in with y'all to see what are some of y'all favorite things to grab at the farmer's market. Heather, I'm going to start with you. Do you like to visit your local farmer's market? And when you do, if so, what do you like to take home with you?
So I am a tomato girl. So I live for those giant heirloom tomatoes that you can basically only get if you have a garden or you know somebody with a garden or you hit up the farmer's market. So like I am here for like the crazy hybrids. Like I want the purple Majesty tomato. Look, I want to eat a tomato in August that is roughly the size of my head. That is when I'm living my best life, and that's what farmers markets.
You like mini watermelon tomatoes.
Right. And so that's what farmers markets are all about. And like, that's when I'm, figuring out like, where do I need to be? Like, if I don't hit up a farmer's market, like every weekend in August, I've made some really bad summer life choices.
Ari, get in here. Are you a farmer's market person? Is that something you look forward to in the summer?
So I'm not yet because, I have actually, like when I lived in Georgia for a time, I actually had started going to farmer's market because they were just more like plentiful at the time, And now in more recent years, one of the things that I want to be more committed to is being closer to the land. I know that feels or that sounds like kind of, but it's more so like at one point I was growing tomatoes and they were growing too much. And I was like, I ain't got time to be coming out here picking these tomatoes. Like I can't do it, right? So I feel like my commitment to the land in that aspect needs to be me supporting farmers, supporting people who are growing the land. And I had actually been, I was talking to Anton Seals, who's over Greater Grow Inglewood. And I'm like, I got to go to Inglewood Village Plaza on 58th in Halstead. And I feel like, Jacoby, you got some South Side recommendations for me too, because, now I got to have some jam.
The 95th Street Market off of like 95th and Longwood. I went there last week. Stopped by my homie Chris Cheney, who it was his birthday this week. Happy birthday to my boy. He's out there every Sunday with Breadhead Bakery, and their chicken sandwich with
Get
the
outta
homemade
here.
spicy pickles, the slaw, bro. Homemade brioche buns too.
Not
Me
the
and my-
brioche.
Me and my mom was on our way to church, and she had the all white on. We had to bib up. We had to bib up before we went. We couldn't go after church because he said he was going to be sold out. So 8 a.m. to 11 a.m., pull up on the Beverly Farmers Market and stop by Breadhead Bakery. Go back and listen to our episode from a couple of weeks ago. Me and executive producer Simone Alisea went over the 3 mistakes you should not make at the farmers market. It's a great episode. We'll drop a link in the show notes. As we said earlier, every single week, we're trying to look at some of the big stories, some of the underhyped stories that maybe people miss, but also we try to give you some good news every single episode. Let's start at the top with arguably one of the bigger stories this week, which was a time for reflection, it felt like. Heather, I want to start with you. This week marked the 1-year anniversary of the inauguration of Mayor Brandon Johnson. We're now looking back, and we're no longer in that space where we're like, oh, this is the underdog campaigner. No, you're the mayor now. You are at City Hall, so we are critiquing you in the same way we would critique anybody else in that position. I want to start here with you, Heather. You wrote a huge piece this week looking back on that first year. I got to ask you my first question, same question I asked the mayor, and he kind of gave me the slippy slips on. What grade are you giving Mayor Johnson for his first year, and why?
So I have to give him an incomplete. And yes, it's a total dodge because it's not a letter grade. But
not you doing this.
Yeah.
I give out incompletes too, but I only give out incompletes because I want my students to do better and give them more time to get the assignments done. But I also give them incomplete so I don't have to give them an F, because I'm like, hey, the system will give you an F. It'll just sort of automatically go to an F if you don't turn things in. Is that the same logic you got here? You giving an incomplete for more time? What?
No. So I think that, yes, because we elect mayors for 4-year terms. We don't elect mayors to serve just for 365 days. So if, Brandon Johnson was leaving office tomorrow, then I think that, you'd have to say he won some, he lost some, and he caused himself some unforced errors that complicated his wins. But I think that's true for every mayor.
We've covered some of his biggest challenges as well as some of his sort of bigger wins in our conversation with the mayor earlier this week. But you mentioned unforced errors. What would you say are those unforced errors?
So, I think that the biggest unforced error in my mind in the past year was when he used his post city council budget approval press conference, which I will be honest with you, I almost skipped because it is typically a dog and pony show and it is almost entirely devoid of news. But I decided, you know what, just let me go. You let me go. And he chose that press conference standing next to a whole bunch of progressive older people to announce 60-day limit on stays in city shelters by migrants. And that was news to all of those progressive older people standing there. It stepped on sort of the coverage of the budget, which is sort of the biggest thing that the mayor does every year. And he also said twice that he would not sacrifice the wants of aspiring Chicagoans for the needs of longtime Chicagoans. I'm paraphrasing a little bit there. And I think it was his most explicit acknowledgement that in some people's minds, the whole migrant crisis has sort of turned into the zero-sum game. Either the city cares for the migrants or they care for longtime residents of Chicago. And whether or not that's true, I think that it was sort of a startling sort of public sort of acknowledgement of that breach. And what made it so difficult for the mayor is because he was elected essentially on the strength of 2 political bases. One, the ascendant progressive movement that has wanted to shift the city left from the days of Rahm Emanuel and Mayor Daley, and sort of the base of Black Chicago voters who were very, very, very proud to elect another Black man as Chicago mayor, only the second since Harold Washington in 40 some odd years. So those 2 bases have different sort of needs and wants and priorities. And the mayor has spent most of this past year trapped in the middle of that. So I don't think it is a mistake that we haven't heard him sort of use that kind of language again, because he was rebuked both publicly and privately. But there was no reason for that to happen at that press conference at that time.
Because it's also like the winter was fast approaching. Since then, they had to walk the 60-day shelter limit back a few times, change it. More conversations amongst city council allies about how do we, like, who is most vulnerable to this shelter limit? Like, who is this going to impact the most? I agree with you. It's one of those things that, and I've said it time and time again, obviously hard decisions have to be made. There are very few decisions that are going to make most people happy. Largely the things were about how they are communicated when the 60-day shelter limit was communicated. If I think about like the Bears announcement, for example, I get why you're making this announcement, but the way you're making it, the way you're showing up. But I will say the Tribe pointed out something, that when a lot of these unforced errors seem to be around maybe political gamesmanship, around sort of how to communicate with the public, the best strategy around that does feel like something that can be learned, something that takes time. And Ari, I want to bring you in here. Same question. What grade, and I get it. I know that we want to save grades for the end of the semester, but we got to give out midterms and first quarter grades. We like to sort of let people know. And as a professor, I feel like you are on my side here. You might be more willing to offer a letter grade. Let me see if I'm correct there.
Yes, I am more willing to offer a letter grade. I would say a B. And I say that because I think that, like Heather said,
You an easy grader like me.
I am an easy grader because here's the thing. Like, I think that the missteps are things that can be recovered from, right? I think that the ability or that desire to please, for example, multiple groups at the same time is what comes from a new politician with the desire to be what he keeps saying, a long-term politician. Keeps saying he wants to be a mayor. That, he told you, right? Like, he
told me again, I'm going to be here for a while.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so with those types of ambitions, there is a constant, there's going to be a pull to appease people who have very differing things from him, right? But the reason why I say like a B is because, like, I think it's so early that he could still do, some really amazing things. I think it's just so early to tell.
So I had about a half hour with the mayor talking about his first year in office, and he said something that's really stuck with me. We were talking about sort of the slow pace of police reform, which you all know is something that I cover a lot and care very deeply about. And I asked whether we would see sort of more public movement, in this second year. And he said that we would, and that there had been a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and that he's not somebody who enjoys groundbreakings, that like he gets invited to a lot of groundbreakings, but he does not like to go to groundbreakings. He told me he likes to be at the ribbon cuttings. He wants to open things up. He wants to sort of celebrate the actual accomplishment as opposed to the start of something. And I thought that was really telling, because sometimes you don't get to the ribbon cutting if you don't focus on the groundbreaking, because people sort of can get frustrated, or they say, well, why isn't anything happening? I didn't see X, I don't see Y. And so sometimes I think that his sort of biggest struggle is perhaps telling his own story. I also think, though, that we're dealing with somebody who is not sort of a typical Chicago politician. He did not come up through the Democratic Party. He did not sort of make his bones by running aldermanic elections. He did not sort of spend his life learning how to raise money and sort of keep donors, happy. That is very different than Lori Lightfoot, who came up in a different direction, and certainly Rahm Emanuel and Mayor Daley, who came up in sort of the traditional machine. And I think that being somebody who was sort of outside the system of power, sort of as an organizer with the Chicago Teachers Union, I think it's a very different sort of set of levers that you have to pull, and sort of different sort of muscles and skills that you have to exercise.
Ari, usually when folks are talking about CPS and CTU, that's Chicago Public Schools and the Chicago Teachers Union,
Yes.
they are often pitting them against one another, a sort of us versus them mentality. But this week, the story was that both groups were down in Springfield lobbying the state to give them more money. Can you explain this for people? Education funding is very dense. So can you make this make sense for us?
Yes. And so right now, even based on the state's funding, right? Every school district they're kind of tiered based on need. And so even based on that kind of algorithm or that calculation, Chicago public schools are underfunded by a great amount. And there's a goal to get CPS up to 90% where they should be by 2027, right? So not even 100%, but 90%. Looking at the school year ahead, CPS is facing a nearly $400 million deficit in its budget. And that's really, really important because we have this increase in enrollment, and that's because of the increase in migrant students, especially, right? So you have a lot of schools that were already probably pushed to the limit, and now they are extra, pushed to the limit. I've personally heard stories from teachers who are like, hey, I'm one of the only Spanish-speaking teachers in my school, and now my class is doubled, or I'm supporting other classes on top of my own classes, right? Teachers who went down to Springfield talked about having 50 students in their class. 50 adults are hard to teach, let alone 50 small people, right? And so we talk a lot in this city about just things we care about, right? We care about safety. We care about, lowering crime. We care about all these things. And if we care about those things, then we got to care about kids and investing in them now, right? And making sure they have a future. And so I think it was really good to see that. However, a lot of officials are saying, okay, but we gave y'all extra money. We have been giving you extra money.
We've been adding, $350 million every year. And people respond and say, yes, that's the minimum.
Yes, that's the minimum. And again, based on that even previous calculation that they made, it's not even close to being 100% funded where it's supposed to be. And again, we have this influx of migrant families, many of them with a lot of small and younger children who are of school age. And Chicago is taking the brunt of a lot of this. And a lot of times it feels as if the state and federal agencies are not helping, right? And so our schools are another example of that system being taking a lot of it financially and needing some help.
People may have heard the evidence-based funding formula come up a lot on this show over the last couple of years. And this is a formula that was introduced in 2017, as you pointed out, Ari, sort of gives money to districts based on those needs from tier 1 to tier 4. Do either of you know what tier CPS sits in right now?
It's like that old joke, DEFCON 1 and or 5, whichever is worse. So it's clear that CPS is the district with the most need because it has the most low income students with the most level of need. I think Ari's, analysis of this was really right. What's interesting, though, is that whereas before under Lori Lightfoot and Rahm Emanuel, the fight for more money from the Chicago Teachers Union was directed at the mayor. But now the mayor, who is, a former CTU organizer, now that sort of antagonistic relationship has shifted to the city united versus the state, sort of represented by the General Assembly and Governor Pritzker, which is a very different dynamic, especially as we have the CTU going through contract negotiations right now. What's interesting about this to be is that this is a fight that I think everybody expected to have in 2020. that was delayed by the pandemic, because that sort of COVID-19 federal relief money really papered over sort of the structural deficit that CPS has been facing for a really long time.
And that money drying up is what's creating the deficit that Ari mentioned.
Exactly. So that's why CPS is sort of in this bad situation. It's also an acknowledgement by the teachers union, by the mayor, that the city doesn't have the money for it. So if the money is going to come, it's got to come from the state. And, the mayor's point, I think, which is, based in fact, is that the state promised Chicago this money, and that they need this money now. And how it sort of all gets resolved, I think, is going to be really interesting, because everybody wants this resolved before the Democratic National Convention. Everything in Chicago wants to be resolved before Joe Biden and Kamala Harris get off a plane. And whether that's going to happen, I think, is very much an open question. But if it is not resolved, it's going to make it a lot harder for the mayor and the governor and the president and the vice president to play one big happy Democratic family this summer. And everybody wants to be singing Kumbaya and coloring in pictures of rainbows and ponies.
The best place to continue to follow these stories as updates come in is to go to chicago.citycast.fm. Please bookmark our website and subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago, where we're sharing you these articles every single day, Monday through Friday. Again, I am here with WTTW's Heather Sharon and author Ariane Nettles. Heather, I want to ask you about what feels like a cycle, right? Something happens within the police force, some misconduct, some use of violence, some use of force. COPA, or the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, makes a recommendation. Again, whether it's you should terminate these people, and then CPD comes back and they say, you know what? I don't agree with those. I don't think I'm going to implement those, and nobody's going to find out about it for a while. It feels like we are back in that cycle yet again on a story you published this week. Can you give us the details?
Well, back in December 2021, Irene Chavez, a 33-year-old military veteran, was arrested for punching and spitting at a security guard at a Southside bar. She was arrested and held at the Grand Crossing Police District, where she died by suicide. And the city council is poised to vote on resolving the wrongful death lawsuit that her family filed against the city for $1.75 million. City lawyers told the city council that the police officers did not properly take care of her while she was in their custody, and she was being held in a holding cell that had a window that allowed officers to see people being detained, but part of that window was obscured with white paper, and that contributed to her death. Now, I wanted to know if any of those officers had been disciplined or held accountable for that conduct that is costing the taxpayers almost $2 million. And in fact, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability recommended discipline for 11 officers, but the superintendent and COPA can't decide on the discipline for the 8 officers who both sides agree were most responsible for Irene Chavez's death. Now, COPA says those officers should be suspended for at least 6 months or fired. And the superintendent at the time, interim superintendent Fred Waller, said that is extreme, that is punitive. These officers should be suspended for no more than 2 months. And you're right, this is a pattern that I have documented time and time again, where the police department sees COPA's recommendations as inappropriate, too harsh, and really sort of, as they say it, counterproductive to sort of keeping officers working at the highest possible level. And that's sort of the root of the tension between current superintendent Larry Snelling and COPA chief administrator Andrea Kirsten. And this is important, not just for this particular case and for the Chavez family, who I cannot imagine the suffering that they have experienced in the last couple of years, but also because the fundamental question facing the Chicago Police Department, as documented by the Department of Justice, is can they hold officers accountable for misconduct. And I think that this continuing sort of back and forth with COPA and CPD really sort of highlights that questions and raises significant concerns that maybe the current setup is either not working or it's not sort of being used appropriately. And until the city and the police department figure this out, they are going to remain under a consent decree, a federal court order, which is costing taxpayers millions upon millions of dollars in oversight and really sort of limits the ability of Chicagoans' directly elected officials to sort of direct the police department.
I think what's really terrifying to me is COPA makes these recommendations. CPD's line of thought is, this is dangerous to us. This goes against helping us do our job. This demonizes us. And the scariest part there is, like, if you left it up to police, they've made it clear we would do most of our arbitrary behind closed doors. Police would decide how police should be punished. We'd probably do more traffic stops, a little bit more stop and frisk. I mean, and now we're seeing an investigation into police actions at the School of the Art Institute. We're going to be having conversations about how police, whether it was CPD or other law enforcement, acted at the U Chicago encampment, the DePaul encampment when they were breaking these things up. It's the scary part is, like, it feels like they reject any system or chance the city takes to create accountability institutions, to hold them accountable. There's almost never a time, it seems, where the police go, yeah, these checks and balances make sense. It's everything is framed as a handcuff on them to do their job. Bro, that's terrifying. These are the people with the military weapons and the guns, and they don't want to be held accountable by the city.
Yeah. And it's not just Chicago. I think this is sort of a national issue, and that Chicago is sort of a microcosm of these issues. But the real question is like, what is the police's job? And this sort of goes back to, sort of what Brandon Johnson promised during the election. He was going to rethink public safety, and he was actually going to reform the police department. And we definitely have to give him incompletes on both of those because, yeah, homicides are down 15%, but that's in line with the nationwide trend. And police reform is only 6% complete. So there's a lot more to be done. But I don't think you can get to either of those issues unless you sort of address this issues of how do we hold officers accountable who we have documented have done things wrong.
Ari, I want to bring you in here on one story that developed right before we started this conversation. Over the last 2.5 weeks, we saw pro-Palestinian protests led by students taking place on campuses across the city of Chicago, Northwestern, DePaul, University of Chicago. Up in Northwestern, there were negotiations with the student protesters. At U Chicago, there was a 4 a.m. raid by police as they yelled and came in tearing things down. For the last week, people wonder, how will DePaul's encampment proceed? Will it go the way of Northwestern with negotiations, or will it go the way of the U Chicago? And we got our answer earlier this morning. We're recording this on Thursday. We got our answer earlier this morning at 5:30 a.m. when police raided the DePaul encampment. Can you give us the latest?
Yes. So the latest at this point is that the encampment is completely clear, and the area where it stood is still blocked off from students, faculty, anyone from walking on it. Protesters, however, are still protesting. They have kind of still lined up along some major streets on campus. As a reminder, unlike the University of Chicago and Northwestern, which are a little bit more secluded in how they are set up, DePaul is really situated, especially its Lincoln Park campus, where the encampment is right in the middle of Lincoln Park, right? So it's sitting along these major streets, such as Halsted and Clark and all of these major North Side streets. And so students are not being deterred from this. 2 students were arrested as of now, they have been released. I have not heard of any more arrests since then. Again, this is Thursday morning as we're chatting right now. But I think that it is frustrating to see because of the fact that the argument that DePaul administration gave for this was that it was for the safety of the students, that this was done with their best interest in mind because they were at this impasse in negotiations. And so I think, that just feels so disingenuous. You're literally, like you mentioned, Jacoby, clearing out an encampment at 5:30 in the morning when people are sleeping. I'm not sure what's going to happen after this, but I think that it seems as if people are they're going to be especially upset that this was handled this way. And once trust is broken between students and administration, that's going to be really difficult to build back up. And we're at the season where students are choosing where they're going to go in the fall. So high school students are watching, right? Like that perspective, the parents of prospective students aren't also watching this. President Schill from Northwestern is actually testifying from Congress today because he did negotiate with protesters. And so I could imagine that the fact that university administrators who did decide to talk to protesters and have a little bit of more care in those situations are now being brought to testify in front of Congress. I could see that also affecting administrations at schools that had remaining encampments deciding to be more forceful to save themselves in a way.
DePaul put out a statement saying that they made the call because they discovered quote unquote weapons as part of the encampment. I cannot vouch for that, but I think it's a really sort of difficult moment, I think, for the mayor, a former activist who has said, look, without protest, I wouldn't be mayor of Chicago. And and everything is sort of ratcheted up because everybody talks about a convention in Chicago and they flash back to 1968, which I have begun reminding people with little provocation was a police riot. It was not a situation where protesters got out of control and sort of, started vandalizing property or assaulting people. This was a riot where the police, directed by Mayor Richard M. Daley, or Richard J. Daley, I should say, overreacted and sort of created this sort of chaos that, had serious repercussions for the nation.
Yeah. If people want to read the statement that DePaul officials put out, we can link it in the show notes. The last thing I want to say on this was the effort, it seems, that officials put in to justify their actions and to paint these protests as largely problematic and a nuisance to the community is very clear. I mean, 625 registered complaints from neighbors, 34 reports of this, 12, 6, 30, so many numbers in this report. And so they went out of their way to say that to sort of paint their actions as justified. We will continue to follow these protests over the coming weeks. As we do with every single episode of CityCast Chicago, we love to end off with some good news.
Hey, all right now.
This is just something to get us through the rest of the episode, something through the weekend, something we're looking forward to. All right, I want to start with you. What is your good news this week?
So my good news this week is the American Writers Festival, which is held by the American Writers Museum. And I am actually going to be participating on Sunday afternoon. I'm moderating a panel. So come out, have fun. Check out the schedule and see if you have any of your favorite authors on there. They're going to be talking about their books.
We've had a few Chicago authors on the show who will be there in some form or fashion. Folks like Evan Moore, the co-author of Game Misconduct. obviously one of the homies, Natalie Moore, the author of The South Side, but also Greg Pratt, who is the author of The City is Up for Grabs, How Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot Led and Lost a City in Crisis. Heather, spinning over to you. What is some good news you want to share with CityCast listeners today?
Well, my colleague at WTTW, Patty Wetley, did a deep dive into what's happening in the woods around the Palos area in southwestern Cook County. So there's an area of woods there called the Red Gate Woods, and it has been overrun with invasive species that is choking out the life of sort of the woods and like making it sort of more vulnerable to fire and just generalized being a mess. And she went out and got a look at efforts to sort of restore the natural habitat in those woods. And it's sort of a test case for the Cook County Forest Preserve District. You know, how much money does it take to do this? How does it work? And what does it result in? And, you know, I am just most of the time consumed with worry about like climate change and like making, you know, thinking about what it means to like, you know, have brought kids into this world, inheriting this sort of earth. And I think it's a really uplifting story that shows that like if you take action and you got a couple of dollars to put toward it, real change can be made to sort of improve the natural world. And it was really heartening. And every once in a while, I think maybe I should become a nature girl. And then I remember that I don't actually like the outside. So it's also a really good reminder that even though Chicago is, you know, a city, we are not far from real nature. And that if you can get out into it, I'm told that can do wonders for one's mental health.
I love it. Again, to learn more about both of these, head to our show notes. Before we get out of here, I have two pieces of good news. One is for our executive producer, Simone Ali Sayed, because she really does not like to get outside unless it's something within walking distance. So I wanted to let her know, hey, Simone, this Saturday, the Argyle Block Party is happening in your neighborhood of Uptown. They're going to have live music, film screenings, and my homies over at Luya Poetry are hosting an open mic at 2:00. I know that you've been in your art bag recently, but maybe you're trying to switch over into your poetry bag. And then I had a piece of good news for me and all of my folks who are listening who might be Bears fans. So maybe we could just say this is for the homie Corley. The Bears schedule got released earlier this week, and they are tied for the third easiest schedule because the folks they're playing this year collectively had terrible records last year. And I'm not gonna lie, I've been allowing myself to get more and more hype. Earlier this week, I talked about sort of the fervor around Caleb Williams picking up after folks saw him in rookie training camp. People are starting to believe maybe we have us a franchise quarterback that maybe we can bet on for the next 10, 15. I'm not there yet. I will never be there. I will only be there after the 10, 15 years is up. But I did allow myself to feel some of that good energy. And now I'm looking at this schedule and I'm not shaking in my boots is all I'm saying. I'm not terrified. We don't see our division rivals until about week 11. And so we got time to just do our work without all of that NFC North pressure on us.
I mean, it's just a resilience of your spirit that I find inspiring because you are just turning away all objective available evidence that the Bears have been bad and will continue to be bad into the future. But you're like, you know what? Stop.
That's that Chicago pride, baby. That Chicago pride.
Maybe this is our year to make some noise, to make the city proud. Let me get my delulus off. Let me start to get back into that delusional state that I was sitting in for.
I love that for you.
On that note, I want to give a huge thank you to our guest today, Professor and author Ariane Nettles. Thank you for being back with us.
Thank you.
And to WTTW City Hall reporter Heather Sharon, we appreciate you making time.
Anytime for you.
Before we let you go, I got to give a huge thank you to the people who make CityCast Chicago possible. Our executive producer is Simone Alicea. Our producer is Michelle Navarro. Our newsletter editor is the one and only Sydney Madden. We had extra help this week from roving producer Dylan Brogan. The music we all love is from All the Kimonos, Mark Greenberg from the Mayfair Workshop, and Sam Thousand. Hey, if you enjoy the podcast, thank you for being here. Share us with your friends and family. Rate the show wherever you listen. Leave us a review. And please subscribe to our daily newsletter, Hey Chicago. The number one thing you can do, be back here bright and early on Monday. We're going to talk to you then. Peace. You just love nature stories. You come tell us about bald eagles being spotted. Now we ganging up on the invasive honeysuckle shrub, which is such a great name for an invasive species. I'm like, why y'all honeysuckle? Why y'all so mad at them? They doing okay. Let them do their thing.